It was November, late November, when the first snows came. They came gently at first, as snow often does. Flakes drifted down like whispers, settling on the shoulders of soldiers, on the turrets of tanks, on the endless stretch of muddy fields that had, just weeks before, been alive with the thunder of engines and the shouts of commanders. But now there was only quiet. The tanks sat in long rows, dark shapes against the pale horizon. They were German Panzer IVs and Soviet T-34s, machines built for movement, for speed, for overwhelming force. But movement had become difficult. The autumn rains had turned the earth to thick, clinging mud that could swallow a boot, a wheel, even a tank tread if you weren't careful. And now, as the temperature dropped, that mud was beginning to harden, beginning to freeze, turning the battlefield into something else entirely. The soldiers knew what was coming. Veterans of the Eastern Front spoke in low voices around their fires, their breath misting in the cold air. They spoke of the previous winter, of the terrible freeze that had come in 1941. When oil thickened in engines, when metal cracked like glass, when frostbite claimed more men than bullets. They knew. And so they waited. Inside the tanks, crews tried to prepare. They wrapped themselves in whatever they could find: blankets, newspapers, strips of cloth torn from old uniforms. They nursed their engines, running them in short bursts to keep the oil from freezing solid. They rationed their fuel, knowing that soon, very soon, they would need every drop just to survive. Outside, the wind began to rise, a slow, distant howl, like something ancient waking from sleep. At night, the cold deepened. It moved through the camps like a living thing, creeping into tents, into foxholes, into the cramped interiors of armored vehicles. Men huddled together for warmth, their bodies pressed close, their teeth chattering softly in the darkness. And above them, the sky stretched wide and black, scattered with stars that seemed impossibly bright, impossibly far away, as if the cold had clarified the air, stripped away everything but light and silence. The snow continued to fall. Slowly. Steadily. Covering the world in layers of white. And in the background, the wind kept blowing, soft and constant, like the breathing of the earth itself. By early December, the temperatures had plummeted. -20 degrees Celsius. -30. The kind of cold that feels solid, that presses against your skin like a weight. And the machines, the great iron machines that had carried men across Europe, began to fail. It started with the engines. In the morning, crews would gather around their tanks, their breath hanging in clouds, and they would try to start them. They would press the ignition, hear the starter motor grind, and nothing. The oil had thickened overnight, become a sluggish, tar-like substance that refused to flow. Batteries, already weakened by the cold, gave out one by one. Some crews tried lighting fires beneath their tanks, desperate to warm the engine blocks, to coax life back into the metal. But fires were dangerous, they drew attention, and fuel was scarce. Even when an engine did start, there were other problems. The tracks, those wide metal belts that wrapped around the wheels, had contracted in the cold. They became brittle, prone to snapping under stress. Crews worked with numb fingers to repair them, hammering frozen pins into place, their hands clumsy inside thick gloves. And all the while the wind blew, and the snow fell, and the cold pressed down. The weapons, too, began to betray them. Machine guns jammed, their mechanisms stiff with ice. The great cannons mounted in the turrets became difficult to traverse. The hydraulic systems that powered them slowed, then stopped altogether. Ammunition froze. Shells had to be brought inside the tanks at night, kept close to the crew's bodies to prevent the propellant from becoming useless. Everything required more effort, more time, more warmth than anyone had to give. And so the tanks sat. Rows of them, scattered across the white landscape, silent and still. Some had been abandoned, their crews retreating on foot to seek shelter elsewhere. Others were manned by soldiers who refused to leave, who stayed inside the metal shells even as the cold seeped through every seam, every rivet, every joint. They sat wrapped in blankets, sharing what little food they had, telling stories to pass the time, stories of home, of warmth, of summer days that felt impossibly distant now. Outside, the battlefield had transformed. The trenches were filled with snow. The craters left by artillery shells had become smooth, rounded dips in the whiteness. Even the dead, those who had fallen in earlier skirmishes, were covered now, buried beneath the drifts, invisible. The war itself seemed to have paused, held in suspension by the cold. And in the distance, far in the distance, you could hear it, the soft, rhythmic creaking of ice, as the rivers began to freeze solid. There is a particular kind of silence that comes with deep winter. It is not the absence of sound, exactly, but a softening, a muffling of the world. Voices carry strangely, seeming both loud and distant at once. Footsteps crunch in the snow with a rhythm that feels almost musical. And everything else, the distant rumble of artillery, the drone of aircraft, even the wind itself, is swallowed by the whiteness. The soldiers lived in this silence. They moved through it like ghosts, their figures dark against the snow, their faces hidden behind scarves and balaclavas. Frostbite was a constant threat. Ears, noses, fingers, toes, any exposed skin could freeze in minutes. Men learned to recognize the warning signs, the numbness, the tingling, the waxy white appearance of flesh that had given up trying to stay warm. Field medics worked as best they could, but there was little they could do beyond amputation in the worst cases. And so men wrapped themselves tighter, and kept moving. Food became an obsession. The cold burned through calories at an astonishing rate. Rations that might have been sufficient in milder weather now felt inadequate, leaving soldiers perpetually hungry, perpetually weak. They ate whatever they could find, hardtack biscuits, frozen bread, tins of meat that had to be thawed over small fires. Some foraged, digging through the snow for roots or frozen vegetables left in abandoned fields. Others hunted, though game was scarce, the animals having long since fled or burrowed deep into the earth. At night the camps were lit by small fires, carefully shielded from enemy observation. Men gathered around them, holding their hands out to the flames, feeling the precious warmth soak into their skin. They spoke little. There was not much to say. The war had become something abstract, something distant. What mattered now was the cold, and the fire, and the hope that morning would come. Sleep was difficult. Even inside the tanks, even wrapped in every available layer, the cold found you. It crept into your bones, made your muscles ache, turned your dreams into strange, feverish things. Some men slept in shifts, keeping watch not for the enemy but for frostbite, checking each other's extremities, shaking each other awake if they slipped too deep into unconsciousness. Because to fall asleep in the cold, truly asleep, deeply asleep, was dangerous. Men had frozen to death in their sleep before. It could happen quietly, gently, almost peacefully. And so they kept each other awake. They told stories. They sang songs softly, under their breath. They recited poetry, passages from books they remembered, prayers in languages their grandmothers had taught them. Anything to stay present, to stay alive, to hold on until the dawn. And when dawn came, it came slowly. The sky would lighten from black to deep blue to pale gray, and the snow would glow faintly in the early light. And the men would stir, stiff and cold, and begin again the slow work of survival. And all around them, the wind whispered, and the snow lay deep and silent. The orders came down in mid-December. An offensive. A push to reclaim territory lost in the autumn. The maps were spread out in command tents, marked with arrows and circles and neat, optimistic lines. The generals spoke of surprise, of momentum, of breaking through enemy positions before they could react. It all sounded very reasonable, very logical, on paper. But the soldiers knew better. They looked at their tanks, at the frozen machinery, at the deep drifts of snow, and they knew. Still, orders were orders. And so they prepared. It took days just to get the tanks moving. Crews worked around the clock, building fires, pouring hot water over engines, hammering ice from tracks. Some tanks started. Others did not. Those that did moved forward slowly, painfully slowly, their engines laboring, their treads slipping on the ice. The advance, which should have covered kilometers, covered meters. Hours passed. The cold pressed down. And the enemy was waiting. They had the same problems, of course. The Soviet forces, dug in across the frozen fields, were dealing with their own frozen equipment, their own desperate soldiers. But they had one advantage: they were not moving. They were stationary, entrenched, and they had prepared. When the German tanks finally came into view, crawling across the white landscape like wounded animals, the Soviet guns opened fire. But even the battle itself was slow. Shells moved through the cold air with a strange, lazy arc. Explosions seemed muffled, their sounds swallowed by the snow. Tanks that were hit did not burn. They simply stopped, their crews bailing out into the cold, running for cover. Return fire was sporadic, difficult. Gun crews struggled with frozen mechanisms, with ammunition that jammed, with hands too numb to aim properly. The offensive stalled within hours. Tanks broke down. Men collapsed from exhaustion and cold. The lines barely moved. And as the short winter day began to fade, as the pale sun dipped toward the horizon, the order came to withdraw. Fall back. Regroup. Try again another day. But there would not be another day. Not really. The winter had won. It had devoured the battle, consumed it completely, left nothing but cold metal and colder men scattered across a frozen field. The survivors retreated, dragging their wounded, abandoning equipment that could not be saved. And behind them, the snow continued to fall, covering tracks, covering blood, covering the evidence of a battle that history would barely remember. That night, as the soldiers huddled in whatever shelter they could find, they did not speak of victory or defeat. They spoke only of warmth. Of home. Of fires and blankets and the simple, impossible luxury of being warm. And outside, the wind howled softly, and the tanks sat silent in the snow, monuments to a war that winter had paused. Winter does not last forever. Even in that terrible season, even in the depths of the cold, there were signs of change. In late February, the wind shifted. The temperature rose, just slightly, just enough. The snow, which had been dry and powdery, became wet, heavy. Icicles began to drip. And slowly, very slowly, the world began to thaw. The thaw revealed what winter had hidden. As the snow melted, the battlefield emerged. Tanks half buried, their metal rusted and scarred. Trenches filled with water. Equipment scattered everywhere. Helmets, rifles, boots, things no one had thought to retrieve. And bodies. Winter had preserved them, kept them frozen in the positions they had fallen. Now, as the ice released them, they had to be buried properly, with whatever ceremony exhausted soldiers could muster. The survivors moved like men waking from a long dream. They were thinner, weaker, their faces hollow and lined. Many bore the marks of frostbite, blackened fingers, scarred cheeks, limps that would never fully heal. They did not speak much of what they had endured. There were no words, really, that could capture it: the cold, the silence, the slow erosion of hope. They simply moved forward, because moving forward was all that remained. The war continued, of course. Spring brought new offensives, new battles, new horrors. The frozen tank battle of December 1943 became a footnote, a minor engagement in a vast and terrible conflict. Official reports mentioned mechanical failures, adverse weather conditions, limited tactical gains. But the men who had been there, they carried it differently. They carried it in their bodies, in their dreams, in the way they flinched at the first cold snap of autumn. History, in its neat accounts, often forgets the small things. It records the great battles, the turning points, the decisive moments. But it forgets the mud and the cold and the quiet desperation of men trying to keep machinery alive, trying to keep themselves alive, in conditions that seem designed to break both. It forgets the nights spent shivering, the mornings spent coaxing frozen engines to life, the slow realization that sometimes the enemy is not human at all. But we remember. In the quiet moments, in the spaces between the grand narratives, we remember. We remember the soldiers and the snow. We remember the tanks, silent in the whiteness. We remember the winter that devoured a battle, that held history in suspension, that taught a harsh and simple lesson, that nature does not take sides, and that cold is the great equalizer. And now, as you drift toward sleep, imagine that snow falling one more time. Imagine the quiet. Imagine the world covered in white, peaceful and still. Let that cold, distant landscape carry you gently away, into rest, into warmth, into dreams. Sleep well.